Okay, wonderful. Okay, we'll get a start on. Thanks everyone for coming in today to hear Michelle talk about procurement in the competitive dialogue, using competitive dialogue. I'll just introduce Michelle a little bit and then we'll move on to her presentation. And like I said before, we'll do some Q&A at the end of her presentation. So Michelle is a senior manager with Ernst & Young Technology and has over 15 years experience in IT delivery and IT sourcing. Michelle is the practice lead of EY's ICT competitive dialogue offering, which is an innovative procurement method. Michelle has led multiple large-scale IT transformation procurements and assisted clients with discrete procurement services in times of peak procurement periods. That's a mouthful of P's. Thanks, Michelle, for coming in today, and I'll hand it over to you. And like I said, please put your questions up on the chat session there, and we'll answer them later. Thanks, Michelle.
And thank you for ACS for inviting me here today to talk on IT. Specifically, we'll talk around sourcing in IT. It's certainly an area that a lot of clients have a lot of pain points with and are seeking assistance. So as per my introduction, my name is Michelle Williams. I'm a senior manager in EY in the Brisbane office. I've had over 20 years experience in the IT space, and in the last 6 years I have focused a lot on IT sourcing, and I've become the practice lead for what we have developed here in EY called Competitive Dialogue Offering. So EY has established various distinct offerings for clients, particularly because the demand is out there in the market that clients are seeking help. So an area there is around sourcing strategy. So this is where a client might have an existing contract coming to life, or they're looking at creating a new contract. So that's where they might reach out and request some sourcing options. So we would help them do a strategy on how they may procure IT services. It's relating to market scans. So we have a lot of market scans that we do ahead of any large scale procurement. So a market scan really leverages, we have data internally, but we also speak to vendors and talk to them about what is their offering, and then we can provide that back as an independent advisor, which has been really powerful. It also generally reduces scope of procurement, because generally rather than going through open tender procurement, we would based on that market scan. Tender development, so I have a team here locally and also nationally that work on tender development. This is around paper-based tenders that go out to the market to procure IT services. So essentially a lot of clients now are moving away from hardware, in-house hardware, and looking at going to the cloud. So we might help them with a tender for cloud services, or alternatively they might be looking to upgrade their HR payroll solution. So we'd be looking at helping them with a tender for that. We also do financial response templates. That's a really important part of tendering, is that we get a consistent response financially from the vendors. So that financial template is really critical that we get that right, and that there is a like-for-like comparison across the tender responses. But we also help with evaluations and all elements of tender development. One of the areas that I specialise and the practice lead where over the years we found that the paper-based approach to procurement simply not working for clients. They weren't really getting the outcomes that they wanted. So we looked at leveraging a process that was created in the European Union, where it's really around a collaborative approach to understanding requirements and also the in EY we call it competitive dialogue. Some other areas call it co-solutioning or co-design. There's lots of different names for it, but it's essentially that we get the client and the vendors in a room and we start to really down on the in a bit more detail in the coming slides. Another area that we provide to clients is a sourcing partner. So sourcing partnership is around where a lot of clients have their own procurement team. It might be a small or a large procurement team, depending on whether it's government or whether it's a small scale company. And then they're looking for potentially when they have peaks, periods throughout the year, having partners that they can lean on to assist them. Also outsourcing some of their high risk procurement. Financial modelling is another key element of IT sourcing because particularly when we're comparing vendors' pricing, and we really need to drill down on the detail as to those price comparisons to price for the client. So we do a lot of bespoke financial modelling. So we have certified practicing accountants that actually are able to build these bespoke models, and they are developed for the client. The client owns them moving forward, and essentially the good part around the financial modelling is when you essentially put the tender out to market initially, you'll get a pricing response. As you go through the tender stages, the phases of the tender, you can actually update the model to reflect things that have gone up in price or areas that have gone down in price, and it really gives you a really clear picture of the comparison against. Commercial advisor is another area that we assist clients. So we have a legal team, we have commercial specialists that can advise you on having already considered what are your areas that you'll flex on and what are the areas that you won't flex on. So strategy or commercial playbook, which essentially is the contract, looking at the departures in the contract where the client that's another area that we provide a service, or we also provide coaching to clients. We have an EY digital law practice. So this really where we do the sourcing side, the commercial advice side, and then the legal side. Depending on the client, some of them will have an internal legal team, and they might like to have our legal specialists speak to them about, for example, the cloud. There's a lot of different legal requirements there, so they might get one of our cloud specialists in the legal department with their team. Alternatively, it could be completely outsourced to an external legal firm, or it can be our legal team to do that work as well.
Sorry, Michelle, do you mind if I just intervene for a moment? Yeah. The sound's cutting out a little. Are you able to move closer to the mic at all?
No worries. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
So as you can see, we offer a broad range of IT sourcing services to clients. So it's not purely competitive dialogue, but today's focus is around the competitive dialogue offering, but we do provide that holistic offering across all of those services. So what is competitive dialogue process? So the competitive dialogue process was originated in the European Union, as I spoke about earlier, and it was looking at for complex contracts where technical solutions are very difficult to define. So the client is not the best person to define what that solution should be. So it's where you essentially develop that co-collaboration with the vendors to then look at developing the best solution possible. It reduces risk. So in the traditional paper-based approach, there is a lot of risk associated with that because there's a lot of assumptions that are put into those tenders, which generally leads to pricing increases, and also those assumptions are never competitive dialogue process, assumptions are both tested with the customer and the vendor. So it gives the customer the opportunity to ask the vendor, why have you thought of this assumption, and can we drill down on that a bit more? And then there's clarity around that assumption. The vendors also have the opportunity, with all of the assumptions that they've put in and then all of the additional pricing they've put in to cover those assumptions, they can also ask the client around the assumptions they have made based on the paper. So it's really good at reducing the risk, and that's why a lot of people are moving towards using this approach rather than the traditional paper-based approach of procurement. And it just provides that collaboration. So collaboration is one of the really strong points of this style of procurement. So if we look at traditional styles, it's generally that a tender goes out in the market, the responses are received back in electronically. There's a evaluation team that then evaluate that paper, and then they make a decision based on an evaluation criteria. There's never generally in that approach where you would actually talk with the vendor unless they're invited in to do a presentation of their solution. In the competitive dialogue approach, it's really a completely different style. So the paper-based is more use case approach, and it's more outcomes driven. It's also about the collaboration. So that collaboration is where vendors and clients get to speak one-on-one about that solution offering. And that collaboration is really important because it provides the opportunity for the client to look at, is this a vendor that we can see ourselves working with over the next 5 to 10 years? So it really is quite powerful in building that relationship, or they could see that, they really don't gel with that vendor, so they really don't see that there would be a long-standing relationship there. When to use it? So predominantly competitive dialogue costs the vendors quite a bit of money. It's not something that is generally paid for by the client. So it is more for those large scale procurements. So generally 10 million plus procurements is what we recommend to use it for. We do, however, as we'll get into the next slide shortly, there's a framework that we use. The framework is very tailored to the specific needs of the individual procurement. So in saying that it's generally for large-scale procurements, we are actually finding that clients are using elements of the framework for smaller scale procurements. So the EY ICT Competitive Dialogue Framework is made up of 3 phases. We have what we call the pre-competitive dialogue, which is a very important stage, which is where we do our planning and our early market consideration and engagement. We have the competitive dialogue phase, which is around where we have that co-solutioning, co-design, collaboration sessions with shortlisted vendors. And then we have the post-competitive dialogue phase, which is around that final offering. Sometimes we do a preliminary proof of solution, depending on whether the client would like that option or not. It's essentially like a prototype, and it just allows them to test the vendor as well in that capacity. And then we look at contract closure. So the framework, as I said, it's a very large framework. Underneath all of this is templates and procedures that we follow. We have a significant team across EY nationally who can deliver this offering. And the framework is really, rather than a one-size-fits-all approach, we really do look at customising this framework to suit the specific client. So essentially, if we just drill down a bit on the framework, so the early market engagement is really around looking at planning out that procurement. And as I said, that planning is really critical for the future phases. If you don't get that planning right, it can really impact those future phases. So we do look at that procurement planning. So that might be, what's the best way to approach the market? We, as I said, we have a whole team that have done this many times. So we have a lot of industry experience. We have cloud experience, we have HR payroll experience. So we bring that experience to the table and talk about what other clients have gone through and our experiences that we've had procuring the different types of services. We look at that tender development planning. So what is the best tender approach? And depending on if it's whole of government, used to be GITC and now it's QITC. So depending on what the client is, we look at, that tender approach that they have to follow. The CD session, agenda and content planning. So we really talk to the client about what CD is and how we look at introducing that into the procurement. We find that a lot of clients that don't know competitive dialogue, we really do train their team so that then moving forward they can execute competitive dialogue in other procurements in-house. So generally the first procurement that we'll do with them, we will train them fully. Then they have the templates and the tools and the procedures, and they've had the experience of actually going through it, and they do use it for future procurements. So at the end of that early market planning, we then do what's called a significant procurement plan. So this could be, generally it's called significant because I'm talking about contracts that are over 10 million. If it's under, it might just be called a procurement plan. So in that tender area there, we talk about market scans. So market scans, as I said, are becoming more and more in demand from clients. So essentially they're looking at, we wish to procure, for example, a payroll solution. Could you tell us, out there who is the best payroll provider? What would we be looking at price per pay, things like that. So we have done a lot of market scans for clients. We leverage that material. We look at Gartner, we look at Forrester, we look at, speaking to vendors as well, like consulting with vendors in the market and understanding their capability. So we do that independently, which is really good for clients because what they find is if they go off and do that themselves, they generally get quite harassed by the vendors to actually looking at, selling their product rather than just having that view of what is out there in the market and have an objective view. So we provide that objective view back to the client, and it's based on their requirements. So generally we will do a little mini requirements gathering phase there to then go and evaluate that market scan for them. As I spoke about, so we do tender documentation. We have lots of templates on tender documentation. The traditional way was that you document requirements, functional and non-functional, for quite some time, where I guess we're looking at moving away from that and looking at an outcomes-based approach. So we look at more developing a use case, and we really leave it to the vendors to come back and say how they would actually implement that use case within their solution offering. Tender evaluation planning is very important. That's another aspect, that you need to spend a lot of time on. It's really around setting up that core evaluation team that will evaluate the tender and also putting a evaluation plan in place. It's also looking at what are the evaluation criteria and what is the weighting of those criteria. So it's important to get all of that documented upfront before you enter into the tender. Competitive dialogue session agenda and content development. So we start to look at the agendas. So generally competitive dialogue would run for 5 to 7 days. And what we do is we issue essentially a tender out to the market, as I said, which is around more the use case approach. And then we look at shortlisting down, and then we invite those vendors into the competitive dialogue sessions. The session agendas, there is some formality and there is, some questions, but what we're looking for is that we move off that question and we actually start that open dialogue. So it's not like it's an interview. It's certainly not an interview. It's very much like an open collaborative discussion. And it's really good because the client may not have specified, for example, their complexities of their IT environment very well in their material, and that's where this will drill down on that. So it allows the vendors to sort of question about their technical environment, complexities, interfaces, things like that. So it's really valuable for that. We also look at planning that preliminary proof of solution. So this is where that's an optional feature in the framework, where if it is for a very large scale procurement, they might look at doing that sort of prototype approach. So that is something that we have to plan early on how we will do that, because once we've got the vendor on site and we're going through this process, we can't hold them up with us, you know, getting our documentation together on how we'll do a preliminary proof of solution. So it's important to have that done up front. Vendor briefing material is developed. So what we find is that there are more and more vendors out in the market that have now gone through competitive dialogue, but for those that haven't, we provide a briefing essentially as well on how to actually, what is expected of you in competitive dialogue, because it is, as I said, an investment in their time, and it is quite costly for vendors to attend. So we ask that they bring their best people, and sometimes they will fly people in, for example, and as I said, it is like a 5-day commitment. So it'll take them out of their business as usual job, and it'll bring them into an environment for 5 days where they have to talk about the tender. So training. So we do have a whole training package in place. This training package is in place for clients as well as vendors, as I just spoke about. We put clients through a 1-day training session, and we're really facilitating and we're really doing a lot of case studies, and we're stepping them through exactly what to expect when they enter into the competitive dialogue sessions. So everyone is informed and everyone's very comfortable. What we don't want is that the evaluation team are not comfortable with the process, so we find the training is really good to bring that comfort level. Once the tender is released to the market, we then can look at the tender evaluation documentation development while that's out in the market. So generally, tenders are evaluated individually initially when they come back, and then there's a group evaluation done. The evaluation team is generally an odd number, so that the voting, you know, we don't have any consistent voting. So we look at generally it's around 5 or 7 people in the evaluation team, and they're really selected from the client side. So generally, depending on the procurement, so if it's a HR finance procurement, they might have people on the evaluation team that are from HR and that are from finance and from IT. Reference checks. We believe it's important to bring reference checks into the process very early rather than leaving it as a, you know, to do at the end of the process. Because what we found there is that you may wish to eliminate some of the responses based on the reference checks. And the reference checks are not that you just provide one referee and they contact that one referee. We look at, you know, you provide 3 referees, and then the client will choose which one they go to speak to. And usually they do an on-site visit rather than over the phone. And again, that's really just understanding if this is a 5 or 10 year relationship and they've got clients already that they've had a 5 to 10 year relationship with, how has that client found that when there's been difficult periods, for example? So it's really important and to bring that forward. So that's where we'd have that evaluation checkpoint. So generally you've got your tender back, you've done your reference check, and then you do an evaluation checkpoint. From that point there, we recommend that the client shortlists down to 3 vendors. And the reason we say 3 is to keep that competitive tension. Vendors all talk in the market, so when there is a large scale procurement happening, they all know that the other competitors that are tendering for that. So it's really important to keep that competitive tension up. We do vendor briefings, so essentially we advise the vendors that they have been shortlisted and what the next steps are. As I spoke about, we do client training and then we do vendor training, and we look at executing and developing, refining, I guess, the competitive dialogue session content. So based on the responses from the vendors, there might be areas that were a little grey. There might be some really obvious areas that one vendor called out but the other vendors didn't. So we'll bring that into our question set to drill down on in those sessions. After competitive dialogue, technical sessions. So we have, as I've talked about, the technical, but then we also have the legal as well. So generally in parallel, there will be legal sessions happening when the technical sessions are happening, and that will be by the law firm of the client. And in some cases, we've had where the technical sessions have gone really well and a lot of good information's coming out, but unfortunately on the commercials, they haven't been able to agree. So they opt out. So that's why it's important to have the 3, because if they opt out, we still need the 2 to keep it competitive. If we only had 2 vendors going into this, then if one opts out, you know, it's highly likely in the market they will know that, and then they know that they, you know, have no competition. So that's not a position we want the client to have. So we shortlist after the technical session. So after the competitive dialogue, we then shortlist down to 2. Now, these technical sessions are really based on what they're procuring. So if they're procuring infrastructure as a service, the questions will be around infrastructure. The questions will be around SLAs. The questions will be around pricing. So depending on what the client is procuring, the sessions are tailored and the content is tailored to meet their needs, so we can really drill down on that information. So when we shortlist down to 2, we then have that option for that preliminary proof of solution. I will speak later on about a credential, which is a flagship building in Queensland, the 1 William Street building. EY is very proud to be the partner for that procurement. And preliminary proof of solution was done for that procurement. So that was essentially, they wanted you come in from another agency and you enter that building and your laptop wirelessly works and the infrastructure works for you, can connect to the network. So that's an example of a preliminary proof of solution. After that, there's another evaluation checkpoint. So I guess the benefit of competitive dialogue also is that there is a lot more rigour around the evaluations. Generally, a traditional approach has 1 evaluation checkpoint or potentially 2. So 1 would be the paper-based tender response based on that evaluation criteria, and then the second one potentially would be reference checks. In the competitive dialogue framework, we have essentially 4 evaluation checkpoints. So there's a lot more rigour, which is de-risking that procurement for the client. We then have the best and final offer. So after the competitive dialogue sessions, the vendors are much more aware and much more understanding of what the client's needs are. So this is where we then request that they revisit their submission, their initial submission, following the competitive dialogue sessions. And that's where the power of that financial modelling comes in, because you really see, you know, when they originally provided their pricing template, this is what things cost. And when they resubmit their pricing template, the variance is huge. So the cost of competitive dialogue outweighs the benefits that they will gain from the pricing decreases that they get. After that, there's another final valuation checkpoint. So that's done after the resubmission of the tender. And then we look at supporting the client in whatever way they would like, so whether that be evaluation document, and then they come up with their preferred vendor. What we are finding now, though, is a lot of clients, when they put vendors through this process, they are putting one on a panel arrangement, for example, and then they award the contract to another. So even though the second vendor hasn't been awarded it, they have the opportunity to be on a panel. So if that client wishes to procure services from that vendor moving forward, they don't have to go through another procurement process because they've already know that vendor, they know their capability and their pricing structures. It's also a bit of a safety net for the client. So if things were to go south, which we would hope they don't, but if they do with the preferred vendor, say after 5 years, then they've always got that backup, that they've got that other vendor on a panel to use as a negotiation or to have them come and step in. So as I spoke about, we do offer legal negotiation, commercial coaching, pricing negotiation and financial modelling services. These are all optional services outside of the framework. We're also finding that clients are looking for technical specialists in, say, infrastructure or in, say, cloud. A lot of clients are moving to the cloud, but we do provide specialists in those different areas as well. Commitment to competitive dialogue process. So this is where it is a process that requires commitment both from both the client and from the vendor. It is generally an intense period of essentially maybe 15 days. So if we have, for example, 5 days for each vendor, we'll have them sequential. So it's essentially you do take a procurement team and potentially the evaluation team and some SMRs out of their business as usual job for essentially a 15-day period. But the benefit is very high. So we do ask that the client brings their A team. So we don't want that the client brings their essentially their A team to the competitive dialogue sessions, and then once the contract's signed, the client doesn't get the people that they actually collaborated with in the sessions. They get essentially the C team. So we do contractually put in place that the people that were in the competitive dialogue sessions representing the vendor are actually the people that the client gets to work with once the contract's signed. And a part of the competitive dialogue as well is really asking them about, so what other clients are you servicing at the moment? Do you have the capacity to actually take on this piece of work? Is it, you know, so we can ask all those sorts of questions as well, which you don't get to ask in a general tender. Preparation is the key in this competitive dialogue process. So you really need to make sure that everything is prepared. As I said, that preparation side is really important, but also around the visual aids. So on the day, even though we collaborate through talking, we do use visual aids as well. So we might use whiteboarding and drawing. The client might present information about their landscape, so that might be up on a board. And then also the vendors might represent and present their solution. So we need to make sure that technically everything is ready and everything's working, because it's really important that we put both the client and the vendor in the best light on the day. As I said, it's not a test. They're not there to be tested. It's all about collaboration. So it's really important that all technology and facilities are really working for them and everyone feels comfortable. So the benefits of competitive dialogue is, as I spoke about, that competitive tension, that is essential. The evaluation rigour, so it increases evaluation rigour, that it's fit for purpose. So essentially, you know, you're not sort of requesting something and getting something that you don't want. Through the competitive dialogue sessions, they really, the vendors really understand what the client is seeking, and it is really fit for purpose. So they do then shape and scale it based on the needs of the client. That, as I talked about, that refined solution. So refined solution is really important. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution out there for every client. So it's really about refining that solution down. Having that outcome focus. So by that I mean that, you know, there are SLAs, so service level agreements put in place for those outcomes, and we work with the client to create schedule orders to make sure that commercially all those things are documented for them. We have a team that I've got there hit the ground running. So we have a procurement team that is a national procurement team. I travel all around Australia providing this offering, and we have a team to support that. So our team comes in with those tools and templates. So clients find that, you know, it really is that we really kick off from day one. Some clients have tools and templates, and we might just look at, you know, do we use the EY ones or do we use the client templates, or do we enhance the existing client templates with information that we can provide. So that's another value area that clients really appreciate, is getting, I guess, some more documentation up to a best practice standard. Lasting relationships. So competitive dialogue, as I said, really builds those relationships with the vendors. The vendor doesn't just simply come in to demonstrate a product and leave that day. It is a 5-day process. They really get to know one another. We encourage that name badges are used, so they talk to each other on a first name basis. And it's really about that partnership, and they really need to assess during the CD process if they can see themselves working with this client for 5 to 10 years. Clarified price. So as I spoke about, generally the price that you receive just on paper-based tender has a lot of inflation built into it for assumptions and risk. Whereas in competitive dialogue, you are really testing, and it provides that vendor the opportunity to test all those assumptions and risks that they have built into that response. And then when they resubmit their response, that's where we tend to see quite a variance in their pricing. And generally, some things, it may not always come down. Some things may go up because they've underestimated certain areas, but generally what we find is it is reduced significantly. And then I guess the last item there is just around the capability driven. So it's really testing that capability. So what we find from that paper-based approach is a lot of vendors, they all know that they have to tick the mandatory boxes. If they don't tick the mandatory boxes, they won't get to the next stage. So a lot of them are ticking things and saying they can do things that they simply can't do. And then this process filters out that. So that's where I talk about de-risking for the client. So essentially that capability is tested, and you do have, in some cases we have had, whereas it has exposed vendors that they have said one thing, and then when we actually get into competitive dialogue, they actually do not have that capability. And that's really good for the client, because then at least they can see that for this vendor, we've tested that capability through this process and we see that they're not our preferred. The key outputs of the competitive dialogue process are that refined solution and service offering. So this is where we clearly document everything that comes out of competitive dialogue is in contract schedules. That's generally done by the legal team, in-house legal team or an external legal team. But as I spoke about, we do have that we can provide that service to clients. Clarified price. So the pricing is clarified, and that's the real value this brings as well, is around that. There's no mistakes around the pricing. The vendors had the opportunity over those 5 days to really question around different aspects of the scope so that the pricing is really at a really good price point. We have an in-principle agreement on the legal issues and the final contract, which is subject to legal drafting. So as I spoke about, we have those technical sessions happening, but in parallel we have the legal sessions happening. So there is that in-principle agreement put in place. Established relationships. So the competitive dialogue process, as I said, it will expose essentially capability, but it also draws on the people side and whether that the client can see themselves working with that vendor moving forward. It is a contestable process, so government use it a lot, and there is probity associated to all of what we do. So depending on the client, it depends on the probity restrictions and rules, but we've done a lot of whole of government work and a lot of federal work for competitive dialogue, and there certainly is a large component of probity, and that is generally, again, either in-house by the client that brings their own probity advisor, or an external probity advisor is part of these engagements. So just on case studies, so I mentioned earlier that we're very proud to have worked with whole of government on the flagship building, 1 William Street. So this is now occupied by over 4,000 government employees across 19 government agencies. And at the time when we did this procurement, the building was being built. So everything was pretty much based on documentation. The scope of those services were meeting room bookings. So essentially they wanted to look at, what are the meeting room booking hardware availability out in the market. User workspace, so this is around having essentially desktops available, but working in that sort of open plan environment. Federated identity, so security management, so single sign-on in the building. Print and imaging, so this is essentially follow me printing, so you could go to any floor and print a document based on scanning your ID card. Wired and wireless network, so that was essential for the building to have the wired and wireless network. Team collaboration and video conferencing, so again having some really state-of-the-art video conferencing available in some of the rooms, particularly for the minister and when they have their sessions. Underpinning support services, so we looked at the SLAs for all of these items that I just spoke about and also the pricing for all of them. And then we looked at establishing that commercial contract. So with this procurement, it was a consortium arrangement. So there was no one vendor in the market that offered all of these services. So essentially a consortium arrangement is where we seek from the market that a single vendor then goes and sources other vendors to provide those services. But essentially the government deals with one vendor. So this was a very large procurement. It went over 8 months and it had a lot of people involved. So we had essentially 3 vendors. We went down to 2 and then we selected one. We did have one that went onto the panel, as I spoke about earlier. So, and it was certainly a really good experience for everyone in government, and now government have used this approach moving forward as well in-house. The other case study that we have is for Sydney University. So recently, a lot of the universities now are moving to as a service economy, so looking at the cloud service offering for the universities rather than having their own in-house hardware. They're looking at leveraging those as a service economy models. So we're helping clients a lot in that space, particularly education at the moment. So the client was seeking that cloud utility service in infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and also the cloud advisory services and migration of the cloud services. EY assisted them through competitive dialogue, but we also provided a cloud specialist as part of this service offering through competitive dialogue. And then they have now moved to the as a service economy, so into the cloud. So just on the final slide there, so we have competitive dialogue leads. So we have Alison Cairns there and myself. Yeah. I'm sorry, is that? And just in closing, I just wanted to add that we are looking for senior cons and consultants in EY at the moment. So if you are interested in joining EY, please reach out to me and we can have a discussion. Particularly in, I guess I'm from EY Tech, so we're looking at IT, people joining in the IT space. I'm particularly keen on people wanting to speak to me about joining in the procurement space, but we also have opportunities across the board in EY, so I welcome you to reach out to me on that.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much. Very detailed and yeah, lots of information to take in there.
There is, yeah.
We have a couple of questions that have come through, so I might just go through them now. We've got one from Duaj. I hope that's spelt right, said right, Duaj. Is there any relationship between competitive dialogue in procurement and customer relationship management systems?
Okay. Can they expand on customer relationship management systems, what they mean by that?
Yeah. Duaj, you still there? Can you elaborate on your question, please, if you can? Just type it in. while you're doing that, I'll go to another question. Let's go up, go back over here. Oh, can you get a copy of the slides? On this occasion, we're going to just put the YouTube post up for you to look at. Here's another question. Does EY utilise data analytics in the preparation of tenders and contracts?
Yes. Yeah, we have a large data analytics team. We do use the data analytics in the market scanning space. So, yes. And if you're interested in joining the data analytics team, please reach out to me as well.
Okay. I'm just replying back to Diwaj, see if he's still there. If there's any more questions, that one's been answered. Okay. All right. No, there's no more questions that I can see. Does anyone else have any more questions? If there's not, we'll just finish up for the day. Yeah, okay, no more has come in. No questions? Okay. Thank you so much, Michelle. Again, and, like I said, everyone, I'll put this up on YouTube, our YouTube channel. I'll send an email out to all those who attended today with the link to the YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Michelle, do you have anything else you want to add, or?
No, just thank you very much for the opportunity. If you have questions afterwards, I'm happy to, if you reach out, I'm happy to answer them. So thanks, everybody.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much again, and have a good day, everyone. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.